Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to do the real minimum requirement to play Atomfall. If you remember the proposed minimum requirement, it was scarce information, as we need a i5-9400F or equivalent, so we don't know the AMD, 16GB of RAM, NVIDIA 2060 or equivalent, not knowing which the AMD side either. But today we're going to find out. Welcome to Response PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. First off, we're trying to find the real minimum requirement, meaning we're going to try to play at 1080p, lowest settings, no upscaling, to reach at least 30 FPS. This is not a FPS game, this is a solo storytelling style of game. Starting from Intel side, I went down from the i5-9400F to the i5-2500, so from 9th gen to 2nd gen. And for the GPU, passed from the RTX 2060 down to the GTX780 4GB variant. And at 1080p, low settings and no upscaling, we get an average of 46 FPS. We're quite far off our targeted 30 FPS. And also mean we can drop the GPU and the CPU in performance. The GTX780 4GB variant and the i5-2500 doing so well, you can even crank the settings from low to medium at 1080p and still no upscaling, and you'll get a 42 FPS average. The GPU is big at 100%, yes, and using 3.1GB of VRAM out of 4. The CPU is in the mid 40% of utilization, and we're using only 7.3GB of RAM, so 16GB is obviously a bit too much, and so does the CPU and the GPU. And keep in mind, I still don't even need any kind of upscaling, so no need to put any Vaseline to be able to play with those low hold hardware. Downgrading the GPU to the GTX950, now we have a 2GB VRAM card, still with the i5-2500 for now. We get back the settings to low instead of medium, obviously, with 2GB of VRAM. The GPU is pegged at 99%, using all the 2GB of VRAM, obviously. The CPU is still in the 40s percentage utilization, RAM still in the 7GB of RAM, and we get an average of 32 FPS. Also keep in mind, this is only the first bandit settlement that you encounter, so maybe if there's bigger bandit encampment or city or village, it may be harder for the CPU, GPU or RAM. That means we can now drop the CPU from the i5-2500 to maybe the i3-2100, still in the 2nd gen, but on the i3 series. We also kept the GTX950, make sure the CPU is not a bottleneck to the GPU. And at 1080p, low settings, no upscaling, we have the exact same FPS average, 32. So our CPU is not a bottleneck to the GPU, and the GPU is doing the job it's supposed to do. But now our CPU is in the high 50s percentage of utilization. We have a little bit of headroom to maybe drop even more. But as for now, a 2nd gen i3 and old GTX950 do the job pretty well. And I decided to go lower on the GPU side, older, because the GTX780 and 780 Ti is way more performance than the GTX950. But unfortunately, because it does not support some function of DX12, you cannot. As you get a warning for the driver, then you get a warning that the real minimum requirement for NVIDIA will be the GTX950. We still can drop the CPU on the Intel side, so let's try a i3-540, 1st gen i3. Also drop the memory to 8GB instead of 16 with the GTX950 at the lowest settings, 1080p, no upscaling. We get an exactly 30 FPS. The GPU was doing its job at 9% utilization with his entire 2GB of VRAM used. The CPU was in the mid 60 to the high 70 and sometime peaking at 95% of utilization, giving us some spike of starter and a bit lower FPS, which give us an average of 30. So expect to get some 20s FPS with that CPU. For the RAM, we're using 6.2 out of 8GB of VRAM, RAM I mean. Jumping onto the AMD side, I go straight to a whole generation, even skipping every Ryzen. I go to the FX 6300 with RX 560. 4GB variant, just to start somewhere. And since I already know that 8GB of RAM is enough, I'm going to start with 8GB for AMD side also. And at the 1080p, lowest settings, no upscaling, RX 560 4GB variant deliver. Is at maximum percentage utilization using 3.2GB of VRAM out of 4. The CPU is in the high 90s to even 100%, but I think MSI Afterburner have some issue with those whole generation of AMD CPU. My frame time time is super smooth. I didn't get to encounter any stuttering even if my CPU is pegged at 100%. And for the memory, we're using 6.3 GB of RAM out of 8. And we get a better average FPS than the GTX960 4GB variant. We are at a 51 FPS average. This is highly playable. You can even crank the settings to medium and even some settings at highs and still be over 30 FPS. Lowering the GPU to the RX 550, still with the FX 6300, was a bad idea. This 2GB of VRAM card cannot handle the game like the GTX 950. Even with upscaling at 50%, we get only 19 FPS. This card is unplayable. But I'm pretty sure we can still drop the CPU. So let's try that out. So changing the CPU to the AMD Phenom 2 X6 1045T with 8GB of RAM and back to the RX 560 4GB variant, we get a similar result. At 1080p low settings, no upscaling, we are within the margin of error. With the FX 6300, the Phenom 2 X6 1045T give us an average of 48 FPS versus 51 with the FX 6300. You can probably go even lower on the CPU side of AMD, but my collection is a bit lacking in old AMD CPU. I mean, I really don't use often my Phenom 2 X6 1045T. What about X4 or older Phenom or even Atlan? I'm also lacking quite a bit in my collection for the AMD GPU, so that's what we'll have to do for now. So our winner for the real minimum requirement to play Atomfall will be the i3 540 with the GTX 950, 8GB of RAM, either Intel or AMD platform. On the AMD side will be the Phenom 2 X6 1045T, 8GB of RAM, and the RX 560, probably lower, but that's what I have in stock in my collection. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one, and subscribe.